ahead. You're on the air.
Okay, everyone. So thank you for coming today. Before we start, I am going to do a land acknowledgement. So the campuses of Illinois Central College occupy the unceded land of the Peoria and Miami nations, as well as other Illini people groups who were exiled from their homelands in the 1800s and forced to live in places that they do not consider their traditional lands. I also would like to thank Professor Jacobson Flex for putting me forth to be able to speak about this. I think this is an important thing that not a lot of people get to hear about. So, especially here in Central Illinois, where there's very few Native Americans, as you will discover through my story. And it makes me proud that I can be here. I'd also like to thank Amy Glass for being there and helping me set up this and kind of keeping on me and making sure that I remember things are going. And also Mitchell Price, who did a photo shoot with me and made some of the media you guys might have seen on Facebook, Instagram, whatever. So we'll just go ahead and jump right into it. Let me share my screen here and I'll pull up my presentation. Cool. I do not need to do that. Oh, sorry. So many things. Okay, so traditional greeting. Halito, sohoshi fo yot Nitakechi, Muckintubbee, sapokni ixisawisia chata sia hoke. So I said to you, hello, my name is Nitakechi Muckintubbee. My grandmother's of the Raccoon Clan, which means I am of the Raccoon Clan, and I'm a proud Choctaw Native American. My colonial English name is Nathaniel Parks. And like I said, thank you for coming and observing my speech, Abnormal Aboriginal. So a little bit about me, as you can see on your right, this is a picture of me with my two sisters and my mom. That's my Native American lineage is through my mother, which is traditionally matrilineal. I'm an Illinois Central College student, much like a lot of you. I am a computer information systems with a technical emphasis right now here. That'll be what I get my associates in this summer. And then when I transfer to Illinois State University, which I've got accepted for the fall, I'm actually going to switch to history and social science education because I think that if I remember from my high school experiences, there's not a lot of equitable history that's being taught. And I think that having a perspective that most students don't get to have, especially in an area, like I said, like Central Illinois, where there's so few of us Indigenous peoples, it's a great opportunity. So that's kind of where I see myself going. I'm also an Indigenous Studies minor, but that's mostly so I can be in a community of people that share similar beliefs and we can kind of, bounce ideas off of each other. I'm Choctaw and Chickasaw. So my Choctaw culture I've always known about, and it's essentially who I am. My Chickasaw culture is something that came a lot later in life. I didn't really know we were Chickasaw, but my great great grandmother, Katie Muckintubbee, who is who I take my name from, she was 100%. Her husband Jonas was 50-50, 50 Choctaw, 50 Chickasaw, and they're like the same people group. Honestly, the languages are almost the same. It's like a dialect of each other, and you'll actually find out the historical connection from them later when we talk about Choctaw culture. I'm also the founder of the Organization for Indigenous Autonomy, which, I mean, does what the name says. We help Native American, Latino, Chicano, and Pacific Islander communities kind of attain self-sufficiency. We do a lot of work with charity organizations. In December, we did a Christmas drive to the reservations for the Anishinaabe in Minnesota. We're doing a lot of work here on campus. There's actually a mound that belongs to the ancestors of the Peorians that we are trying to get respectfully labeled. A lot of people don't know there's a mound here. I didn't know there was a mound here until Professor Jacobson Flex told me. So that's something that we're going to be working on throughout the semester. So what are we going to talk about today? I'm going to talk about growing up in a community with very few Native Americans. I lived in Bartonville and I went to a mostly white school. So I never really had experiences with people that were like me culturally or even that really looked like me. I didn't even have a Hispanic classmate until maybe 8th grade. So from K through 7, it was just me and the white kids and the black kids. And when I say, the white and the black kids, I mean maybe like 2 black kids, mostly white kids. So it was a little strange coming from a culture that's underrepresented. When you're in schools, they try to tend to make things a little bit more geared towards their students. They talk about some of the successes of the different cultures. I was the only native student, so I didn't really get that. I kind of had to learn how to relate to, white history, black history in a lot of ways and try to pull similarities, but it's nothing quite like hearing the successes of your people. So that sort of led to a lot of differences between me and my classmates, which kind of led to a little bit of bullying. And that led to me really repressing my identity for a lot of my childhood. I'm going to talk about finding my culture, which happened way later in life. I was maybe a senior in high school, coming towards the end into my gap year. I took a year and a half off before I came to ICC, and kind of talking about building up and I guess yearning for it and working to get it back and where that has led me to. We're also going to talk about boarding schools, which I wanted to tie this into Trevor Noah quite a bit more because, I mean, there is me not fitting in, but there's also the fact that for a long time it was illegal to be an Indigenous child. Um, they had the motto, kill the Indian, save the man. They would send Native American children to these boarding schools where they were converted into white culture. You had to do, your hair would get chopped, your names would be changed, everything about you was completely different. So we're going to focus a lot on that towards the later part of the presentation. I'm going to talk about Choctaw culture, what it means to be Choctaw, things like that. And we're on to my origin. So this was me as a baby, sitting there indigenously. Growing up, on the left, I was maybe 5 or 6. So the first stories that we talk about are going to be encompassing that. And then on the right was my junior year of high school. So kind of the big gap of when I had to suppress my Indigenous identity and try to fit in with people that I wasn't really similar to. So attending a mostly white school, like I talked about earlier, they don't really have much information for kids like me when it comes to my people, my success. I mean, I didn't really learn about Native Americans at all until 5th grade. I mean, we were loosely talked about and maybe like a history section or two that talked about like Lewis and Clark and the expedition with Sacagawea and stuff like that. But that's not a very broad history. That's more of like the pioneering history of the United States, which didn't really connect with me that much. And we're going to talk about school holidays. I think this is the big one. School holidays for me were they were a little weird. This first story comes, I was maybe 2 years older than the picture you see on the left, so maybe 7, 8, something like that. And it was Columbus Day. And Columbus Day for Indigenous people is not a day that we typically celebrate because it's not really relevant to us in general. Apart from all the controversial stuff, Columbus did not find the continent for us. We found the continent, so it's nothing really for us to celebrate. But we had a project when we were younger, and essentially the teacher cut out paper boats, and we had to color the flag of the country that our ancestors came from on the sail, and we would stick them all up on the door so that we could show how diverse our classroom is. Now, I brought my project home. We could do it over the little, I think it was a day off that we got, and bring it back. I brought it home. I said, Mom, what's the flag of the Choctaw Nation? She helped me look it up on her computer. I colored it out real quick, took it to school the next day. And well, not the next day, but the day after that, obviously. And my teacher had looked at it and she asked what it was. And I said, it's the flag of the Choctaw Nation. And she gave me like a weird look, and she took the boat and she crumbled it up into a ball. And, loud noise, silent classroom, everyone looks. And she says, you can't be Native American. Native Americans are extinct. There's no full-blood Native Americans left, so you can't be one. Now, I'm not full-blooded Native American, but that's the culture that I grew up in. Sapukni, my grandmother, she taught me, Choctaw ways when I was young. So for me to hear that and to think about all the experiences I've had and to look around and see kids that don't look like me, they don't have that same culture as me, I mean, it kind of made me small. I have all these kids staring at me. My teacher told me that I messed up the assignment. She crunched it in a ball, threw it in the trash. She said, try again, and you're not going to get the full grade because you didn't do it right the first time. So that kind of made me realize that there's not a lot of people that are going to be looking out for me. I mean, my teacher when I was a little kid, 7 or 8, this is traumatic stuff that people go through. I wanted to be very quiet about who I was, and for the longest time, I wouldn't talk about my Indigenous ancestry. And then, of course, there's Thanksgiving, which this story is a little bit more humorous. It wasn't as like traumatizing per se, but I would remember, maybe you guys remember this too, when you were younger, your teachers would have you dress up as the Pilgrims or the Indians. Well, they made me dress up as a Pilgrim. I wasn't very happy about it, but they kind of told me to get over it. And it was kind of weird to see all my friends sitting around wearing the supposed Indian hat with the feather and the headband and doing the wah 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 and all that. So um, I wouldn't say that that was as detrimental to my identity, but it definitely compounded the idea that my people are a joke or they are an ancient caricature of some sort. then we had a segregation discussion, and this kind of made me realize that I'm sort of at a split. My teacher in, I think, the third grade, she took a piece of tape and she laid it out across the rug. And I think this was Martin Luther King Day or somewhere around there. And she said, "Black students, I want you to stand on this side, white students on this side." Where does that leave me? So there's, three black kids in my class. They go to this side, the white kids here. No one knows where I go. Now, she had no idea either. And I said, "Where do you want me to stand?" And she was like, "Well, I don't know." And she didn't really understand that there was segregation against indigenous people. Uh, in the 40s in Montana, we had our own seats that were away from the blacks and the whites. We had to sit up in the very top with, I think it was also segregated for Japanese people. So we had to sit with Japanese people back then, who, keep in mind, were in internment camps during that period of time. So to understand that my teacher didn't know where I fit in, and I don't know where I fit in, and my classmates were arguing about where I go, it kind of made me realize, like, how do I fit in? Kind of like Trevor Noah. He didn't know if he could hang out with the black kids because they saw him as too white. He didn't know if he could hang out with the white kids. They saw him too black. It was just a weird situation for me to be in. And because of that, I tried to really, I guess, build up and mask my identity, like I talked about. And hiding my racial identity to fit in really, really, really hardcore started about 5th grade. We talked about the Trail of Tears. Like I said, I'm Choctaw. We were the first tribe to walk the trail. Um, that was from Nanihuaya, Mississippi, all the way to Durant, Oklahoma. That's, 1,000 miles. It's a long march. And kids started making fun of me because of the Trail of Tears. They would, make the smallpox blanket joke, or they would basically say that, the American Army didn't get them all. And middle school kids are very, very, I would say they're very savage and uncensored. So, when it comes to stuff like that, I don't think that our teachers are really giving it um, that dark tone to it. They just teach it as a part of history. They're not telling these kids, like, they're not teaching it like it's as bad as the Holocaust, like it's as bad as the Tutsi Hutu genocide, the Armenian genocide. They just say it as a objective fact that at some point in time America kicked us out and did this force march. And at that point I was like, okay, I really can't tell anyone I'm Native American. I'm done talking about it. I'm tired of all this. And that led to me losing myself. And over the course of these years, probably about high school age, I really started feeling empty because I didn't have my culture. And culture is very fundamental to people, I believe. Your culture, in a lot of ways, can define your values, it defines what you believe, it defines a whole number of things. And to not have culture and to not recognize your culture, especially for a minority in the United States, it's tough because as much as I can hang on to my white ancestry and try to play that ball, I still have the tan skin, I still have the long black hair, the brown eyes. Um, a lot of people growing up thought I was Hispanic, Mexican. I had been racially profiled a lot by police, even in my youth. One specific instance when I was probably about 12, I was playing a game of hide and seek in a neighborhood just across the road from where I lived, and a lady had confronted me thinking I was selling drugs in her neighborhood. I'm a 12-year-old kid just hanging out with my friends, and suddenly I'm a drug dealer. So, it kind of made me realize I can't bag on just acting white, because if I act white, it's not like a lot of white people are going to accept me. And that's not to say that all white people are going to throw me away, but there's a lot of racists out there that really are, purists. And if you don't look white, then you're not white. And they will call the police on you for doing, like I said, things like that. And that was a source of that emptiness. And I think as I got into my gap year, I started to learn a lot about this process called decolonization. And what decolonization is it's removing colonial aspects of your life to try to essentially get back in communion with your ancestral culture. And that's something that I was unfamiliar with. I mean, up until that point in time, I was still very much hiding my identity. I didn't have connections to other Native Americans, but I started doing a lot of research. And I think the event that really changed my perspective on Indigenous rights was researching Wounded Knee 1973. So, Wounded Knee, the situation there is that the Oglala Lakota, which is a tribe in South Dakota, they had a president who was supported by Richard Nixon. His administration kind of propped him up, and he had a private military called the Goon Squad. And what the Goon Squad did was they would kill political dissidents, journalists. They would strong arm voters, go door to door with guns to basically ensure that these people were voting for the Oglala president. And he had support from numerous amounts of American federal agencies. Now, the Oglala people were tired of living in this dictatorship. Life is very tough on Pine Ridge, which was the reservation that they were living on. It's the poorest place in the United States. Unemployment at a low is like 85%. The average person, family makes maybe $2,500. I mean, it's absolute poverty. And to top all of that with a dictatorship where you don't have that free expression, it's tough. So these individuals from Minneapolis, they formed the American Indian Movement. It's a group of all different tribes: Cherokees, Choctaws, Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, a bunch of Lakotas, and they took their firearms and they went to Pine Ridge, Wounded Knee, obviously the site of the massacre that occurred in the 1800s. And they said, we are not going to let the authorities, because at the time, this is basically a country within a country. And it's like, who do you report these crimes to if the authorities are the ones that are committing them? You have to report it to outside organizations. And AIM became that outside organization. They stormed Wounded Knee. They took it back. They basically set up a free place for Oglalas that were tired of being persecuted to stay. And then the Goon Squad came. And they came with support. They came with the Federal Bureau of Investigations and numerous armed convoys of police officers. And this led to a big shootout. Two indigenous AIM activists died, and I think one police officer died. There was no recorded event on who shot first. It's one of those Battle of Lexington things. Obviously, either side's going to think the other side shot first. But as a result of this protest, even though it was a failure, 1973 they shut down the residential schools, the boarding schools, which were mandatory for a lot of indigenous kids. And that really made me feel something, that you can still be an activist. I mean, this is relevant. My grandmother watched this on the news when she was, taking care of my mother growing up. And that made me feel prideful in a way. And that's when I started reinstating my Choctaw identity. And, being a Choctaw to me is about being in communion with that culture. It's about honoring my ancestors and honoring their ways. And it really filled a void that I had in my heart. So I'm going to tell you about the Choctaw people. This is Push Mataha. He is our most famous chief that we had. He was with us during the Treaty of Deer, I think it's Dancing Rabbit, where they kicked us out of Mississippi and we had to go to Oklahoma. Chata and Chickasaw were two brothers, ancient brothers. This is the oral history of my people. We originally lived in what would you today call Baja California, beautiful area in southern, or I guess western Mexico. And it was very overpopulated because it's such a beautiful place there, but there wasn't a lot of food and war was rampant. We were a very nomadic people at this time. We were carrying the bones of all of our dead. We didn't have a permanent place for them. And so these two brothers said, we need to find a home. So they consulted a Hope, which is like a religious priest of sorts. They said, we need to find a home for our people to bury our dead because we have generations and generations of bones that we are all carrying. He said, I'll tell you what, I'm going to take this pole, you stick it in the ground, and we're going to camp overnight. And whichever direction it points, we'll travel that way for an entire day the next day. And then we'll do it again until it stands perfectly up. So they traveled the first day, stuck on the pole, traveled the second day, stuck on the pole, blah, 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 kept going. Probably maybe a year later, I mean, Baja California, they got to this grand river, which they called the Misha Shapokni, which is, an old river. And they said, okay, if we're going to cross this, we can't travel for a full day. So because we have to keep bringing our dead, we're not going to leave our dead at the side. We have to keep bringing them. So they travel for half a day, come back, get the dead, travel for another half a day, keep going. And they went for a while until they found this stream that they followed down river to this beautiful open field. They stuck the pole on the ground, went to sleep, woke up, and Chata was the first to see that the pole was sticking straight up. And he had declared that they found their home. So they got together and they erected this ginormous mound, which we call the Nanihuaya, the Mother Mound. and they buried our dead in that mound, and they declared it the home. After they were able to do that, and we had all the bones of our ancestors buried, Chickasaw went and inspected the pole, and he actually determined that the pole was not standing straight up, it was still pointing northeast. So Chickasaw said, we have to keep going. And Choctaw and Chickasaw argued, and they kept arguing, and it turned into a brawl. And Hopi came forth and said, hey, there's no need to fight. If you believe, to the whole village, if you believe that Chickasaw is correct, go with Chickasaw northeast. If you believe that Choctaw is correct, then stay here. So a good portion of the people believed that Chickasaw was correct, and Chickasaw led these people northeast into what we now know as Kentucky, Tennessee, northern Alabama, northern Mississippi, and that became the Chickasaw people. And Cheta stayed, became the Choctaw people. And then obviously over the years, people left, split off, became the Creeks and the various other confederacies like the Miccosukee. And that was the origin story. And that just shows how connected the Choctaw and the Chickasaw are as a people. And then obviously we had the Columbian Exchange. Christopher Columbus met the Arawak and did what he did, arguably committed genocide, but definitely spread disease and encouraged slavery. We didn't feel the effects of that because we never met Christopher Columbus. Our first European friend was De Soto. So De Soto was a conquistador who would go to Muskogee lands, take a chief, take him to the next Muskogee land, take another chief, take him to the next Muskogee land so that he could have safe passage the entire time. And he gets to Tuscaloosa, who's the paramount chief in Alabama, and Tuscaloosa says, I'm not going with you anywhere. Soto demanded women, he demanded food, and he demanded porters. And Tuscaloosa said, I'm not giving you any of that. And DeSoto said, we'll kill your entire village. So he said, okay, look, I can give you those things if you come with me to Mobila, which was this big fortified city. DeSoto said, okay, I'll go with you to Mobila. Took some porters, went to Mobila, got there. The Spanish man, story says, tried to force a native to carry his armor in Mobila, and the native said no. So the Spanish man chopped off his arm, and then the entire city at that moment just started firing arrows because the way Mobila it was set up, it was a cross section road, and the center was a pavilion where everyone kind of hung out, and all the buildings were facing towards the center. So it was just a straight ambush on DeSoto's men. DeSoto survived, got out, regrouped with his men, and he said, we're going to burn this to the ground. Not a single woman, elder, or child will survive. And that's exactly what they did. They slaughtered the entire city, and that was our first experience with Europeans. Obviously, the Trail of Tears, everyone learns about when the United States government kicked us and various other Muskogean, Cherokee, Illinoisan ethnic groups, sent us to Oklahoma, and essentially made us lose our connection to our old habitats and our old homes. Then we have boarding schools, which is the most, I guess, arguably modern incantation of this sort of tyranny that my people have faced. There's obviously things like the Dakota Access Pipeline, stuff like that, but this is the most recent, I guess, government supported act of unarguable genocide against my people. So boarding schools. From 1860 to 1973, millions of indigenous children were sent to these and indoctrinated. There were so many people that were sent to these, we actually don't have an exact number because records indicated that a lot of times when indigenous children died, the schools just wouldn't report it. At a point in time between the US and Canada, you were more likely to die in these boarding schools than if you were a soldier during World War II, which is the deadliest war in human history. And these are children ages 4 to 16 that had to experience this. I'm going to talk about my great-grandfather Nathaniel. My great-grandfather Nathaniel was not born Nathaniel, but he is the child of Katie Muckintubbee. He was sent to a boarding school in the 1890s. He went to Goodland School. There, they cut his hair. They gave him the new name Nathaniel. They beat him for speaking Chata Nampa, which is our Choctaw language. He essentially had to forcibly go through almost kind of like what I had to go through as a youth, getting rid of his identity, except this was mandatory. This was something that if he did not do, he was going to be beaten possibly to death. And, you know, he lived his entire life through these boarding schools. By the time he got out, his family was evicted from their land. He never found them again. He's pretty sure they died. He was 16 at the time when he got out. He basically lived a year doing odd jobs after that. He joined the army, fought in World War I. He was a translator for the Choctaw Code Talkers, who are the predecessors to the Navajo Code Talkers. He was an artilleryman, so he would get coordinates, transmit them, etc. Came back to the United States. He was promised American citizenship. Keep in mind, we did not have American citizenship at this point as Indigenous peoples. He did not get it until the American Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, when basically all American Indians were roped in and given that ability to be citizens. And because of that, it kind of makes me weary, because we were fighting for a country, speaking our language, which was illegal, and that's what saved the nation essentially in World War I and World War II. The works of these code talkers were almost unbreakable, like Enigma codes. It was a way that we could transmit information that the Germans and the Japanese and the other enemy countries at the time could not break. And this man came home, my great grandfather came home to a country that didn't want him. They wouldn't hire him for a lot of jobs because he was indigenous. He basically lived a pretty frugal life, right? So that really kind of infuriates me in a way, but I'm glad that he was able to uh, have that experience and to survive it and to still give us our culture and to raise his kids in the culture, and that really shows resilience. Speaking of his children, two of my uncles, Sylvester and Thurman, were also both sent to residential schools. They were the eldest. I think Sylvester was sent in the 40s. Thurman was sent in the 50s. Sylvester was named Sylvester already. Even though his parents had gone to residential school, he still had to go because there's still that chance that he would be corrupted by indigenous ways. So he went through the same situation, beaten, told not to speak on Nompa, all those different things. And at the end of it, he got out. He ended up fighting in the Korean War, came back again, um, came back to a United States where not every Native American could vote. The right to vote for all Native Americans wasn't established until 1968, despite being citizens. So he went through this terrible period of, abuse, molestations, and he came out way different. He wasn't really proud of his culture. I mean, he was just like me. He was really hiding it because he was taught that it's the way of the devil. Same with my Uncle Thurman, except his story got a lot worse when he got out of residential school. He joined a gang. He was heavily involved in drugs. He was trying to suppress all the stuff that happened to him. He ended up fighting in Vietnam. Um, After he got out of the army, he kind of switched his life around, but you could tell that he was still very depressed and he was very much suppressing these things that happened to him. And that's a trauma that actually never got to be addressed in him because he did pass away still not very connected to his indigenous ways, unfortunately. And then we have the story of Nanihuaya, which was my grandmother's 5-year-old cousin that went to Goodland School. Nanihuaya has a Choctaw name, Mother Mound. She refused to take the Choctaw name. It was illegal to attach to your clan, which is like your extended family, in the residential schools. And Nanihuaya, as a 5-year-old girl, was beaten to death by a member of the clergy that ran Goodland School. I think it's a Presbyterian school. But the report that the family received was that she died of a broken heart. So there was no justice for Naniwaya. These criminals that committed these things, they totally got away with it because it was supported by the American government. It was policy. She was considered the criminal in this situation because she didn't adapt to the white ways, as it would be put. I will say, however, my great grandfather lived a full life after this. He really got into his culture. He was working his hardest to be a good family man. And, he was able to readopt and re strategize and teach his kids the ways. And as you can see here on the right, this is my Uncle Thurman, my Aunt Glinda, my Uncle Pete, Uncle Joe, Uncle Sylvester, and my Aunt Rose. And out of all these kids, only 2 of them had to go to boarding schools because when the BIA came for the next in line, who would have been my Uncle Pete my great grandfather was there with a shotgun, and he said, "You will not take and you will not destroy the identities of any more of my children." And you could see that because he stood up to the BIA, his children really became proud of being Choctaw. They didn't have to be indoctrinated. They still did live in that world that wasn't the same as the old ways, but they were able to come into it on their own, and they were able to essentially develop a Choctaw mindset that was compatible with the country, the United States. It wasn't that they became savages like the American government originally had thought. They adapted that culture so that it was still applicable in modern reality. And, it's very powerful. Pete ran for chief quite a few times throughout his life. Uncle Sylvester, after he got out of the residential schools, became older and started to relearn the ways. He's been on the council forever. He just retired this year with a career on the council that went from like 1970 until literally last year, this year, something like that. Indian Health Services. I mean, all of these people were able to bring that back because of the courage that my great grandfather and his two firstborn sons had and endured in their resilience, fighting the residential school, fighting these colonial ways. And it's powerful to me, you know. In summary, growing up, like I said, it was something that I felt scared to talk about. It was something that I obviously couldn't hide, but my experience, I think, instead of growing up indigenous with the full culture for that entire time span, it makes me prouder that I was able to, over the course of time, get it and start to learn it and start to really experience it, because it's a yearning. It's something that you want. And I just think it's so powerful that people can experience something like that. Finding my culture, especially like Chickasaw culture, which like I said, was was suppressed from my identity for a long time. It's so interesting for me to learn about this other culture that's basically a clone copy, a carbon copy of my other culture, but there's distinct differences and there's distinct languages and belief systems that, I mean, it's so complex, but to be able to find that and to take that and implement it in my day-to-day life, it's really changed who I am as a person. We talked about the origin story of the Choctaw, again, Chata and Chickasaw, going through this long voyage, which eventually found us our homeland in Mississippi, which of course we ended up losing through the Trail of Tears. And then we talked about residential schools, which one of the greatest cultural genocides in history. And I do think it's interesting that we can read a book like Born a Crime, where we talk about these things in other countries, where we talk about these things in, South Africa, or we talk about them, maybe in Australia or something like that, a different country, and we act like it can't happen here. But the fact is that it did happen here. And if we don't have equitable history, if we're not teaching about these things that happen in the United States equally as much as we're teaching about the things that happen in other places, it happens again. I remember being in high school, Illinois instated Genocide Week. You have to talk about three genocides: the Holocaust, you have to talk about the Armenian genocide, and you have to talk about the Hutu Tutsi, the Rwandan genocide. Where was the talk about my people? We live in a state and a city that is named after indigenous peoples, and in this state, less than 0.6% of those indigenous peoples are indigenous to Illinois. Most of those peoples live in Chicago for work. They're not Peorians, they're not Miami. And that's really sad, because you get a separation from your culture, your traditional medicines. Those people, they know how this environment's supposed to work. They've been here for 30,000 years, uh, maybe plus. Science, might prove otherwise. But at the very minimum, 30,000 years, indigenous peoples have been on this continent. We talk about environmental solutions to a lot of things, but we don't include the correct voices. The people that know how to make Illinois a healthy environment are now living in Oklahoma because we kicked them out. Same with us in Mississippi. And you kind of see that, today with, I think it was last year, California, like the whole state was on fire. And it's important to realize that when the Americans, when Europeans came to California and they saw the indigenous peoples doing controlled burnings, they illegalized it because they thought, why are you burning down the forests? Now we know that Mediterranean shrublands need to be controlled burned, other words, or otherwise it'll spread like wildfire. And just last year they legalized it, and they were begging these tribal peoples to commit this practice that they had been suppressing for hundreds of years. It only goes to show that, this knowledge, we can work together in harmony with this knowledge that has been suppressed, but we have to, as a society, not just indigenous, not just white, black, whatever, as an American society, we need to come together and we need to make things equitable for everyone so that we can all share the experiences that we have as people in the American mosaic. So, Yakoke, for your time, I really appreciate you all coming out. This speech means a lot to me. I hope you all learned something that you might not have been taught in history class. And let's see here. I'm going to open it up to a question and answer session. If anyone wants to ask me anything, I guess, is there like there's like a raise hand thing on Zoom, right?
Yes, there is.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do like the raise hand thing, or if I can see your camera, raise your hand, whatever. Anything you have to say, go ahead.
I just wanted to say thank you for sharing your story. That I know it takes of a lot to do that, to put yourself out there, and I'm just sorry that you felt you had to suppress who you were for so long, but I'm glad that you found your way back. So, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, obviously, I have something to say. I always do.
Go ahead.
The way we met, obviously, was you joined the environmental club, right? And so you touched on that at the end. And I just think one of the things that struck me in one of our first discussions was the irony of women getting rights in the United States. And you're like, women have been in charge of right? So the women's rights thing, but just the environment, I just did a little prairie burn at my house, and what you were just saying, there are people who know exactly how we should do that, bringing them back into the story. One of the things we're doing now, a lot of these people are here from my conservation biology class. One of the things we're moving into discussing now is how to involve the people who live in an area with all the decisions that need to be made. And I think that that's one of the things that interests me the most in your story is there was no decision but to live off the land, right? It had to be a part of that culture that you lived in, right? And so I just wondered if you could speak a little bit to that, to the environmental connection.
Yeah. So, first of all, I'll touch on what you said about women. Yeah, it's very interesting to me, the idea that, when the settler state started forming, that women didn't really get these rights because, like you said, our entire organization as a people, as Choctaw people, was based around our women. I mean, our clan mothers, so like my grandmother or people her age at the time, they would be the ones that made all the decisions. I mean, we didn't even go to war with other tribes or other clans unless every clan mother consented on both sides. If there wasn't consent, then we would just have to play ishtabole, which is kind of like lacrosse, but a little bit more deadly. um, we did not do things without the permission of these women. Our women are even we're the only tribe that allow women to do the warrior dance. And that's because the women were warriors. Men were essentially hunters. We brought home meat. The women farmed. They did the trading. They fought in all of our wars. I mean, our women were the matriarchal kind of setup of our society was based around the idea that women are sacred. And so when you had to apply the settler beliefs, it was such a change because our women went from being sacred to being squaws, is what they would say in that racial slur. So there's that. Also, when it comes to being able to take care of your homeland, think about European nations which live in Europe, like Germans living in Germany or English people living in England, things like that. Their countries very typically are relatively clean. They are beautiful places. You look at the colonies that they made. Colonies were designed so that you can extract resources from an area and bring it back. Now, the United States was different because the workers in the colony, the miners, the loggers, the fishermen, they said, we're not going to extract our resources unless the British give us representation. And so these workers basically had their revolution, broke away, but they kept the colonial mindset of let's over extract from the environment. They cut down so many forests. They've opened up tons of pit mines. Our carbon emissions are insane. We have this almost like overeating idea in the United States because we did not shed that mentality of we need to take so much, liquid assets. We need to take from the earth as much as we can. No one shed that idea. And then when us indigenous people were doing it as a means of sacredness, like I said, controlled burnings or knowing which herbs are medicinal, things like that, it was illegalized because it's witch ways or it's satanic. And that was really, detrimental to the United States' development. I feel like if our communities worked together, you would see a much cleaner and greener United States. And that's actually something that the OIA is working on. We are currently working on a project that we call the Great Return, where we are working to see if we can't incentivize indigenous peoples from their homelands to come back. Specifically, we're targeting the Peoria Nation of Oklahoma because they live in such a tiny stretch of Oklahoma. I mean, they used to span the entire state of Illinois. So, if we can look at ways that we can bring them back home and that they can come here and they can give their input, because Illinois is relatively progressive when it comes to looking at ideas on how to change our energy system. I think that the Peoria people, the Miami Nation, the Illini people need to be a part of that conversation because they have been taking care of this land for tens of thousands of years. They know exactly what you need to do to make sure the prairies are healthy. All the over farming and agribusiness here is destroying those traditional landscapes. I mean, we live in the prairie state. How many of us have actually seen a prairie? They're almost entirely gone. So having those people back, getting them on conservation boards, getting them in legislation, having them be a key player in their homeland's decisions of their environment, you will see a much greener approach to keeping the state healthy, air quality wise, life expectancy and things like that.
You're singing my song there. We live in the prairie state. How many of you have ever seen a prairie? I think every student I've ever had has heard me sing that song. All right. Any of my students have any questions or any comments on any of this?
I recognize Imogen there, I think. We have international relations class together. Hi, Imogen.
Hi.
Do you see why this connects to our class? Most of you?
Oh, totally. It really makes me sad, that people that lived here their whole entire lives, and know the environment, and you're just shipped off to a whole nother place that you don't know. And that's sad. Like you said, you have valuable information for this area that we could be using, but those people are no longer here. Sad.
And that even expands past the 1800s, which was what we traditionally believe that the Trail of Tears was. In the 1950s to 1960s, the Indian Termination Act was a law, and that meant that the federal government at will could pass legislation to disenroll large amounts of tribal people, to disintegrate tribes, and they can send them anywhere they want. So this is a fact. There are more Chickasaws that have been sent to live in California because of tribal termination than there are Chickasaws in the Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma. They didn't move there for economic gain during the gold rush or anything like that. The Americans in the 50s and 60s said, you guys need to go, because these tribal governments were getting a lot of citizens. I mean, we were growing. The Choctaw Nation's the second biggest organization of tribes in the entire United States. And our people group, the Muskogee people group, we all share these similar values. So they were sending Choctaws, Chickasaws, Creeks, Cherokees, all these people everywhere. they were like, you guys can't, you can't federalize, you can't become a unified people, you guys can't, become of great numbers because it's a threat to the colonial state. So I have family that live in California, not by choice. And now that they live there, it's so economically unfeasible to come back because living expenses in California are crazy. Moving to Oklahoma from a place where you might have an established family, job, things like that, it's insane. There's plenty of clans that we have, like the Choctaw clan in California. They had to form because people were tired of not being at our powwows, at our dances, doing things like that. But it's insane to me. I mean, literally, my mom could have been sent to California by the United States government, and I would have had to have lived my life there. So, luckily, my family had the choice of leaving Oklahoma. They came to Illinois to work at Caterpillar, like everyone that lives in Illinois, Central Illinois specifically. Uh, and I'm very, blessed that I was able to grow up in a culture that really teaches me how to value family, how to value women. My grandmother, she's upstairs, I'm her caretaker right now. She teaches me so much every day that I never would have known by learning in a classroom. And that's just because, like I said, there's not equitable education for all Americans. And I think that's something that needs to change.
I thought of something else I learned from you that I bet most people sitting here don't know: the numbers. Can you tell people how many, like you said, you can't be a Native American, an indigenous person, they're extinct, right? I bet many people here have no idea the numbers.
So a lot of people, like Professor Jacobs Fleck said, don't think that there's a lot of Native Americans. I'll give you the statistics from North America to South America altogether because we are one indigenous American people. There is 70 million of us. We are actually the majority race between North and South America altogether. We are the majority of this continent that we call, the Americas. In the United States in particular, it's like 5 million of us. Canada, they have a little bit of a higher percentage. Mexico has the highest percentage of indigenous people, which kind of gets me thinking about the whole idea that, Mexicans are, they're illegals or something like that. These people descend. The only difference between me and a Mexican person today is that my ancestors walked from Baja California to Mississippi before America existed. That's the only difference. If you look at a Choctaw, an MCBI Choctaw, which is 100 to 50% Choctaw, they are indistinguishable from a modern Hispanic person from like the Yucatan or areas like that. So yeah, it's important to realize there's 70 million of us. I mean, we are a large community, and that might not even include unrecognized tribes like the PD or the Lumbee, who are, they are indigenous people, but they just weren't given the right to come together as an official tribe because the American government just didn't want to give them any equitable payment for their land being stolen.
Would it be possible for me to ask you a question? It is so wonderful to hear your story, and I really, really appreciate it. Your perspective is amazing. I have a question about, you've talked a lot about the environment and, Native Americans' understanding of our environmental issues. And, we have a new Secretary of the Interior. And I'm just curious from your perspective, what's the most impactful thing that she could do for Native Americans?
So thank you for that question. I'm actually very happy that Deb Haaland is our Secretary of the Interior. That controls such a wide range of things: national parks, it controls the Bureau of Indian Affairs. She is the first Secretary of the Interior to put forth the initiative to have a task force on missing and murdered Indigenous women, which is, if you don't know, an epidemic in Canada and the United States. 16% of missing and murdered women are Indigenous. And there's not really any investigative authority going on here because you have all these different, the federal government, state, county, tribe, they're all butting heads about who's who and what's what. And the girls are dead by the time everyone finally figures out what they're doing, and it's disgusting. And Deb Haaland's finally saying we need to take responsibility for this. These Native American women, they need someone that's going to be looking out for them. So I think that's important. The most important thing that Deb Haaland can do right now is, I think, start to look at, because she is technically in control of the National Park Service, she should start to look at including the indigenous tribes that exist in those areas in how we take care of the National Park Service. Under former President Trump, there's been so many lands that have been taken from the National Park Service and converted into resource mines that are traditional indigenous lands as well, and we get no say in that. And President Joe Biden has done, I think, a lot in terms of making the Native American people trust him, especially with putting Deb Haaland up as the Secretary of the Interior. But there's no saying that after him, there's going to be someone else. Or, I mean, as long as this country exists, we are going to be butting heads with the system because it was designed to eradicate us. So, what Deb Haaland can do right now is try to get lasting policy that's going to make it so that indigenous people have the loudest voice when it comes to a lot of environmental concerns, national parks, maybe with the EPA, things of that nature. And if she can network with those tribal communities and she can establish some sort of council of, environmental equitability, then that will, I think, change the course of this nation when it comes to our environmental policy.
There was a question that came through on the chat, although she indirectly sent it to me by question, by private message instead. She grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and her Indian friends prefer to be called Indians, not Native Americans. What is your preference? And she says, if you're not comfortable answering that, that's fine.
That's okay. And that's true. A lot of people do go by Indian. I mean, we were called Indians forever. A lot of people go by Native American. I know people that don't want to be called either of those things. Typically, I'll refer to myself as a wide variety of things, but at the core, I call myself a Choctaw. I'm a Choctaw. I've been in Choctaw before there was Native Americans, things like that. My grandma calls herself an Indian. That's just the culture that she was brought up in. Maybe your friends were brought up in traditional environments with people that were also at residential schools who heard the word Indian thrown around a lot. So uh, I don't take it as a derogatory term, the word Indian, as long as you're not calling me like a redskin or something, we're probably fine. So, but I prefer Choctaw personally. That's just what I identify as. But thank you for asking. I do appreciate that.
We have a little bit more time here. Does anybody else have any other questions?
I'm wondering if anybody read the book and anybody has any connections to that. Having read the book, I thought that that was the part, like when he's in school on the playground and he's like, he didn't fit. So there, they actually have a different category called colored. And that's what he actually was, but he was never raised with those people either. And so he really felt like he was Black, I feel like, because he was raised by his Black mother and his Black family. But those people could not associate with him because being colored was illegal. And so kind of like what you're saying, being indigenous is somewhat seen as being illegal because you had to be trained out of that, brainwashed, it sounds like, out of that. So to me, that's why I thought of you for this talk. I'm like, this seems so much, because I just heard the talk you made. That was the connection I made. So if anybody else read the book, I wondered if you saw those parallels.
I actually thought it was an interesting point that the South African Europeans saw their mixed kin as basically being lessers, to the point where they had to legalize it. In the United States, people that were mixed white, mixed Native American were actually seen as superior to Native Americans because it was thought that they developed some sort of white intellect, and as such, they should be able to own property, they should be able to go to real schools, all things like that. So I thought that was an interesting comparison that, these indigenous people in South Africa, their children were treated as sometimes worse than them, even by their own community. there is some, idea that Native Americans rejected a lot of the mixed blood people because they got those privileges that they might not have had. That's a part of the trauma that was instilled upon us in colonialism. But I couldn't imagine personally what it would be like to live in that society where being a mixed person like I'm basically like, in terms of my racial demographic, it's similar to Trevor Noah's. It's illegal for me to be who I am. So, but like I was telling Amy Glass before we started, it's very powerful that Trevor Noah could come from this very impoverished life. And he is now one of the most famous talk show hosts, internationally. And he's able to write this book and he's able to tell his story. So, that's very powerful for someone on any side of the racial aisle.
Any last minute? If there is nothing else, I want to thank everybody for attending today. Thank you very much for giving this presentation to us. That was so fascinating. I knew nothing about that from the boarding schools. Was what was interesting to me, is that I knew none of that before. So and I agree with you that we need to get this kind of stuff taught in history. I think if I'd been taught this in history, it'd have blown my mind. So if there's nothing else, I did put a link to a feedback form into the chat. I will also email that to people, so that I would appreciate getting some feedback on that. And if nothing else, I'm going to stop the recording.